The Guardians declined an option for some potentially affordable pitching depth. We'll tell you what it means as the first important date of the offseason on the calendar passes.
You are Locked On Guardians, your daily podcast on the Cleveland Guardians. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, friends, Guardians fans all around the world. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Locked On Guardians. It is our favorite half hour of the day. We hope it's yours as well. So, for the next half hour, we're talking about your Cleveland Guardians, the only daily podcast that covers the Guardians from the majors, the minors, the draft, and everything in between. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm just Lada, one of your two co-hosts for the show, and I have been for the last 3 years and counting before joining my friend and coach, Jeff Ellis, who is off today. I spent 18 years covering the Cleveland Guardians farm system as a prospect writer and editor from Arizona to Columbus. I want to thank you for making Locked On Guardians your first listen today and every day, wherever it is that you get podcasts. And shout out to all the everydayers. Shout out to the insiders. Shout out to everybody in the club as well. Thank you all for being here and supporting the show. We finally have some news to talk about. So I know some of you have been sticking around. Maybe some of you haven't been, but it's a good time to jump in because we finally have some news to talk about on today's show. Later in the show, we'll get into another clue about where to point the finger when it comes to Guardians' offensive struggles, and we'll address some rumors that we're ignoring for now. In a little bit, we'll talk about the state of the Guardians' 40-man roster after a series of moves on Thursday and what that means for their Rule 5 and non-tender decisions that's coming up in less than 2 weeks. And leading off today's Locked On Guardians, the Guardians declined John Means' option, and that's very telling about his comeback and the team's view on pitching depth and their roster heading into 2026. Before we jump into all the newsy stuff, today's Locked On Guardians brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, if you're a new customer, you can bet just $5. And if that bet wins, you're going to get $300 on the bonus bets on the app to use. Download the FanDuel app today. All right. So the Guardians didn't feel like picking up John Means' $6 million option. To me, that's their way of saying that they kind of thought the kind of depth he would provide was not worth the price tag. I think that's very telling where Means is at in his comeback in terms of what he can offer a major league team. The rehab was not good for him at all. And $6 million is a very reasonable price for pitching depth. Trust me, it really is. I think a lot of people would agree with that. And you've seen a lot of guys take less money you got, that to stay on their teams. You've seen a lot of guys get the qualifying offer because they think that those guys. I mean, Brandon Woodruff got the qualifying offer for $22 million, I think, and he might pick that up. I don't know. It's a very weird bet. And I know I had about 6 or 7 insiders text me, well, hey, Alex Cobb got $18 million last year. Yes, he did. Jeff and I have buried ourselves in that joke, and it won't go away. So thank you for keeping the bit alive. Alex Cobb did get that last year, and the Guardians felt that even $6 million was too much for John Means. Just looking at John Means' comeback, we're going to ignore the lower level stuff because we know that's not really translatable. It's just lower level, whether it's Arizona, whether it's Lake County where he pitched. Just looking at AAA, okay, he had a 7.97 ERA in 20 and a third AAA innings and 8.12 fielding independent pitching. He struck out 15 and walked 10 in 20 innings. Now, obviously, control was the last thing to come back when it comes to pitching surgeries, especially Tommy John. And John Means will be 33 in April. Struck out 16%, almost 17. He walked 11%. AAA hitters had a 934 OPS off of him. He got hit hard. He gave up a very high barrel rate. He didn't strike anybody out. Walk rate was just very mediocre. The only thing he really did well in his rehab in AAA was he got some chases, 67th percentile in chases, almost 29%. But everything else was really bad. Guys were not swinging and missing. They were making a lot of contact in the zone. They were taking a lot of swings in the zone. They weren't swinging and missing. They were barreling everything. And we've talked a lot about the importance of barreling. And if you look at the Stuff Plus numbers from him, if you're into that kind of thing, which this is like WRC Plus, but for an individual pitch where 100 is average, 94 on the fastball for the plus stuff. It was an average of 90 miles an hour on the fastball. He had one above average pitch that graded out in his 20th and third innings. Now, it's a small sample, so we can be careful with those things and say that. It was a 110 plus stuff plus for the changeup. It was a good pitch, which the changeup's always been his bread and butter. And it got not a really good whiff rate or usage rate on it, but he used it a lot, and it was okay. The whiff rate was 15%, so it wasn't that great. Actually, the whiff rate was higher on his slider, but the slider only had a 96 stuff plus rating, and his knuckle curve was even worse. So the stuff overall wasn't good. When they did this with Matt Boyd in 2024, he was coming off of one Tommy John surgery, even though he had not been healthy most of his career. John Means has had basically 1.5 healthy seasons. He's coming off his second Tommy John, and the rehab didn't go well. And the Guardians were not exactly hurting for depth the way they were in 2024 when Matt Boyd was making his comeback. And Matt Boyd was pitching well, so that, was easier to plug him in and see what happens. This year, by the time John Means got healthy, he was ready to join the rotation at the end of the year, and they kept going with the 6-man rotation because it was working very well. And they got to the end of the year, they were pushing to make the playoffs, try to win the division, and they didn't use. That's why we said earlier this week on the show that we didn't think it was a guarantee they'd pick up John Means' option. I thought it was maybe 50-50 at best, and the price tag would suggest that, $6 million for pitching depth is really valuable. But what does that say about what John Means can bring to your team, at least the Guardians, if they don't believe that his abilities at this point are worth $6 million on this market? And, I know some people are going to try to spin it about money. And, we'll see. I don't blame anyone for jumping to that conclusion. And on your jump to conclusions, Matt, name the movie. But, given the Guardians add him for depth purposes in 2026, and they are, 99.9% unlikely to ever have Luis Ortiz pitch for them ever again, and they won't have Ben Lively in 2026. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Not picking up John Means' $6 million, I think, says a lot about his current abilities. That's a drop in the bucket for them, even for the Guardians. And they could get this wrong. They could. They don't make every decision perfectly, but they make better decisions than more often than not when it comes to pitching. So I think they've earned the benefit of the doubt on these decisions, at least when it comes to pitching. I don't think this one worked out, and maybe he'll go somewhere else and he'll provide value. We'll see what happens on the market. It's not a great pitching market. Maybe somebody else gives him an opportunity to pitch and he looks good. I think there's also a chance that he is cheaper than $6 million. The Guardians very easily could have declined the option and decided, what, let's negotiate with John Means and let's bring him back for, $3 million. Maybe they're saying that what they saw, other teams have the same data. They have the same video. They don't have maybe the intel on the health and how he was feeling when he was coming back, but he'd have to take a physical anyway. So maybe the Guardians think that when other teams get a chance to talk to him and look at the stuff, they'll think, we're not paying him $6 million either. So we'll see what happens. Based on what we saw publicly last year from the data, what we know publicly, what I just stated, I don't think you could sit there and say John Means was a worthy gamble to say, all right, Joey Cantillo or Slade Ciccone or Logan Allen or Parker Messick, this guy is going to pitch above you, and one of you is not going to have a starting rotation spot, given how good they all were, especially at the end of last season. Messick was already slated to go to AAA anyway. I think what this does impact is their ability to kind of use starting pitching as a carrot for a bat in a trade, if they're ever planning on doing that. Because if you brought John Means and you thought, okay, well, our 1 through 5 is Bybee, Williams, Cantillo, Ciccone, and then Means, and we have Allen and Messick, we can dangle somebody for a bat. That definitely impacts this, whether or not they actually renegotiate with Means to bring him back on a lesser contract, because, again, he just didn't fare that well last year coming back. We'll see what they decide to do on that. And we'll see what other options are out there for them. As, we've seen a lot of the qualifying offers, the options. We still have the non-tender deadline on the 21st, so there could be more guys that are put in the market anyway. So the Guardians might take their chances on depth in the market and see what happens. Maybe they'll renegotiate with John Means. But I think they've earned the benefit of the doubt on this choice. And I think it says a lot about, they know very well. I mean, the public data wasn't good. I can't imagine the private was much better and what they knew. Otherwise, I think $6 million would have been a drop in the bucket for them. So they've earned the benefit of the doubt, and they still need pitching depth. So they should explore other options. We're going to discuss those options in the minors, beyond the minors, and what the 40-man roster looks like and how these moves impact it, coming up on the rest of today's Locked On Guardians. This episode of Locked On Guardians brought to you by Prize Picks. Look, we have to make decisions every day. That's just part of being an adult. But I don't know about you. I think that when we make decisions, the right ones, we should get paid for it. And that's what you can do over on Prize Picks. So you want to heat things up with the sports action as the weather gets colder and follow the NBA and the NFL. There's really no better time to join. I keep saying Prize Picks is really the easiest, most simplest way to play daily fantasy sports because all you're doing is picking more or less on at least 2 player stats. And if you get those right, you're going to win. It takes you less than a minute to put that lineup together. You got the Cavs in action against the Wizards tonight. You got the Browns on Sunday. Maybe you want to take Myles Garrett's sacks and you want to stack that with some other stats, or you want to pick more or less on something else. You can go ahead and do that. And if any of your players leaves with an injury, Prize Picks has the injury reboot that's going to save your lineup from a loss. Who else is giving you that kind of mulligan? So download the Prize Picks app today. Use code LOCKEDONMLB. That's going to get you $50 in lineups after your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONMLB for $50 in lineups after your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, where it's good to be right. Keep up to date with all things Guardians this offseason by hitting the bell on YouTube. So you get notified whenever we've got a new episode of Locked On Guardians, and you can auto-download wherever you get podcasts. We're free everywhere, and you can keep the show in your feed no matter what's going on, even during the holiday season. So you can be up to date and sound smart at the Thanksgiving table with all of your friends and family and tell them you listen to Locked On Guardians and debate that. All right. So the most notable outrights coming from the rest of the moves on Thursday, we had Ben Lively, who was outrighted and chose free agency, Colby Allard, Dom Nunez, Matt Crook, and Will Wilson, as well as Lively, all outrighted off the roster. And they had to re-add, because there's no 60-man, there's no injured list at all in the offseason. They had to re-add Andrew Walters, and they decided to re-add Will Brennan and Sam Henches. The question to me now is, will they keep Brennan? Will they keep Henches? Those are all questions going forward, too. Let's really quickly talk about starting pitching and this team, because they decided that John Means, was not really worth their $6 million for depth. Again, maybe they'll sign him to something a little bit cheaper, or we'll see what they decide to do. But right now, your depth as far as starting pitching in the system is, it's Joey Cantillo, and it's I'm not Joey Cantillo. It's Parker Messick, I think, is kind of your 6th guy right now. There's still Doug Nikhazy, who is there. And then you got Cal Steven, who came back last year after the injury when they traded for him for Shane Bieber. You've got Austin Peterson, who is Rule 5 eligible himself. Daniel Espino's on the 40-man roster. Speaking of Daniel Espino, real quick sidebar here. He made the Arizona Fall League Fall Stars game that's coming up next week. However, he won't pitch. He is no longer on the Surprise Saguaros roster. As far as I know, like right now, talking with you right now, I have not heard that it's injury related, that it sounds like he is just going into normal offseason mode so he can prepare for spring training. That could change, but that's just the information I have right now, that this had nothing to do with an injury as far as him not being on the roster and pitching. But, I'm not guaranteeing that can't change. So you have Espino, who I don't think is a starting option personally. We'll see. So they do need some depth, right? You have Cal Steven. We'll see what happens with Peterson in the Rule 5. I do wonder if this makes it more likely they'll add Peterson, because what they could do is they could go ahead and bring back Ben Lively on a smaller deal again, like they did a year ago, and they non-tendered him and brought him back. We know that Ben Lively is going to miss most, if not all, of 2026 because he had to have 2 arm surgeries, Tommy John, and then there was another tendon injury, I think, that the one in his forearm or something. So he's going to miss pretty much all 2026. If he's an option, it's late in the year. So he doesn't really even count as depth. And they might sign him to a bridge deal where they rehab him for the year and see what happens the following year. The free agent class for starting pitching is ugly with a capital U. It's one of the worst I've seen. Again, you've got Dylan Cease and Framber Valdez and Ranger Suarez, and Zach Gallen, who's coming off a terrible year, and Shota Imanaga, who the Cubs also declined, which I thought was interesting. They decided to give him the qualifying offer. It's just not good. In terms of depth, it's not good. There's good guys at the top, And there's a bunch of like 4-5s out there. There's Merrill Kelly. And Michael King is good. But there's Merrill Kelly, who's a 5. Eflin, Littell, who are, 4-5 types. Verlander, at this stage of his career, is a 4-5. Dustin May just hasn't been proven. Molly was good last year, Tyler Molly for the Rangers. Soroka's been terrible. Scherzer's not what he used to be. John Gray's career might be over. Aaron Savali's out there. Lucas Giolito's out there. Adrian Hauser. Like, it's pretty bad. If the Guardians didn't think John Means was worth $6 million, I don't know what they're going to think about the rest of these guys. Like, you've got, Cody Ponce, who's coming back from the KBO. Teams will be interested in. Maybe they like Chris Paddock, I don't know, as a depth option. Griffin Canning was a guy that was on their radar last year. I thought they were going to sign Griffin Canning a year ago, and he was good in limited time with the Mets last year. So maybe they go back to that well with him. Other than that, it's pretty bad. Like it's Andrew Heaney and Tyler Anderson and Walker Buehler, Cal Quantrill. Bring him back on a AAA deal. They're going to need to bring somebody in, and I think they will. I think they'll most likely bring somebody in. But I don't think it's going to be a major league deal. I'm pretty sure that all they're going to do is bring in some veterans to pitch in AAA and see if maybe they'll do a bridge deal. We'll see what happens. But I think that mostly it's depth. I think they're going to go with the rotation guys they have and see what happens with, Messick and Nikhazy and Peterson and Cal Steven. As far as the 40-man roster goes, they're at 37 guys right now. So they decided to not move guys like Henches and Brennan, who, could have been on the fringes on a decision like this. They could have been on the decision. So Will Brennan's back off the IL, and, they activated everybody because there is no injured list at this point. But all those guys are back off the injured list. The roster's at 37. I could still see Zach Kent losing his spot at some point, right? They don't have any roster fodder left, so that's important to note. It's enough fodder. I do think Will Brennan is a guy who winds up being a casualty when it comes to the 40-man roster situation next week when we get to Rule 5 decision day. I think Brennan's a guy. I think they'll hang on to Henches. They paid Henches all year in 2025 knowing he wasn't going to pitch, and he's not going to get like a raise in arbitration, so they might as well just hang on to him because they already did it last year and he should pitch this year. So I do think that they'll just hang on to Sam Henches at this point. So the only guys left on the roster are guys like Kent and Will Brennan. Everybody else on this roster there's no longer fodder unless you. I take the back. Nolan Jones, I think, is going to lose his roster spot. I just don't see any way that he sticks around. And Franco Aleman, I don't think they'll dump him off the roster at this point, but I don't think his roster spot is safe either. Depends on who they want to add. I do wonder if this makes it more likely for him to add Austin Peterson to the 40-man. I don't know if he was a slam dunk before, but maybe Peterson is more likely now than he was before this. And looking up and down the roster, like we talked before about Yorman Gomez, I think should be added to the 40-man roster. So that's a guy you got to put on. And then there's Steven Perez, in addition to Angel Henao, and that's most of the big guys. Obviously, we talked about Cleo Watson yesterday. I know some people don't agree with that, but maybe they'll bump Will Brennan and keep Cleo Watson. We'll see what happens. But they have options. Again, Brennan could go. Zach Kent could go. Franco Aleman, in theory, could go. I think Nolan Jones could go. One of Rodriguez or Noel could also be bumped. Honestly, they're redundant, and I'd rather keep Noel, as crazy as that sounds, than Rodriguez. But those guys could all be bumped too, depending on how many people they want to add. So I wonder if not having Lively and not having John Means gives them more reason to hang on to Austin Peterson just for the depth purposes, because it's just Nikhazy and Messick and AAA next year if everything goes well. And the other thing I account for too is when you get to spring training, pitchers get hurt. Someone in spring training might get hurt. And you're going to need that. You're going to need those extra pieces. So that's why they're going to bring in depth guys. That's why I think it makes sense. I mean, yes, they'll have Steven, who isn't Rule 5 eligible, but they could use him in 2026 anyway. But that's why it might make sense to hang on to guys like an Austin Peterson and Yorman Gomez, who's not necessarily ready. And there's Dylan DeLucia, too, who I failed to mention, who could see some Rule 5 love, too. I'm not sure I buy him as high as the other two guys I mentioned, but we'll see. I think it's an interesting situation. They definitely still need more pitching depth. All right, we have some rumors out there that I think are pretty safe to ignore at this point. We have some free agents to cross off the Guardians list already. I'll tell you who in just a minute. The NBA is back, and the Cavs are fun. That's how I know it's back. And there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel. They are the official sports betting partner of the NBA. If you miss the start of the game on Friday, maybe your high school football game, but you get home in time to see the rest of the Cavs game, maybe you want to ride the hot hand, maybe Donovan Mitchell is kicking butt in the fourth quarter. FanDuel's got live bets on everything who's going to score next to fourth quarter comebacks, and you can combine all of those live bets into a same game parlay for a shot at a bigger payout. As I've said, I like the bigger payout. Cavs are giving up 13.5 points on the road to the Wizards. The Cavs won't have Lonzo Ball. The Wizards aren't good. I know they've got an emerging star, too, so maybe you're playing a hunch that they won't cover. Maybe they will. You can check all that action out over on FanDuel. Right now, FanDuel is giving Locked On Guardians who have not joined FanDuel yet $300 in bonus bets. So when your first $5 bets wins. So head over to FanDuel.com to sign up and play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. You can also join the Locked On Guardians Insiders Club. If you're in need of more Guardians talk beyond the show, and we know you're not getting it too many other places these days, there's a couple good podcasts out there. Obviously, our friends over at the Selvius Godcast and some other places you can get some Guardians talk. But you can follow Jeff and I on social media at Jeff MLB Draft. You can find me at JL Baseball, JL_baseball. So you can join the Locked On Guardians Insiders Club. We text with the insiders every day about the Guardians, news, rumors, monthly video chats. We get mailbag questions from the insiders, and we deliver some bonus written content as well. You can sign up at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnGuardians. And if we buy any of those rumors that we're seeing out there, we're hearing, the insiders will let you know first with a text before we record a show. And for us, it really depends on who reports what and what the context is. And that's why it's even worth talking about if it is. The first thing we'll note here is that the Angels are quote unquote shopping Taylor Ward and Joe Adell. Now that comes from John Morosi, who, as a sideline reporter and a bilingual speaker and a game guy, I like him a lot. But as a news type person in baseball, not anywhere near the top of my go-to list. You can believe what you want to believe and think what you want to think about this stuff. And I'm not saying you don't want to get excited about the possibility of trading for those guys because they could help the Guardians offensively. But given that it's coming from John Morosi and he's saying shopping, I don't buy it. Again, we talked about shopping earlier in the week. I don't know that teams are necessarily shopping guys in general because maybe you have some guys you're trying to move off your roster, but Taylor Ward and Joe Adell helped the Angels last year. They were good players for them. They have been good. I mean, Taylor Ward has been good for them. Joe Adell has finally, after all these years, found a way to be productive on the field. So I don't buy that they're shopping them. Maybe they're taking calls. I don't get shopping. Again, I said those are two different things. Taking calls is one thing. The Guardians listening in on everybody but Tanner Bybee and Jose Ramirez and at one point the closer who will not be named. Not anymore. Those are taking calls. That's not actively shopping. So I hate the definition. But we talked about Ward a ton in the past. I know Jeff and I both like Taylor Ward. He'd be a great fit for this team. And we talked about Joe Adell on yesterday's show. You can go back and check that one out a little bit. Jeff, brought up some data on him that why he's so poor defensively, and he basically is a DH, but it is what it is. I don't believe the Angels are shopping those two guys, considering the source and the GM situation. We mentioned yesterday, Perry Mason has 1 year left on his deal. They hired a manager for 1 year. Those two are tied together. So those guys are both fighting for their jobs. If they're trading Taylor Ward and Joe Adell, they're not going to get better next year. It's not going to help them. They can't trade hitting for pitching. Their pitching's bad, but they don't have any hitters to step up behind them either. So unless Art Moreno wants to cut money, but even then, I don't see it. It's not like Taylor Ward and Joe Adell are making that much money. So I don't buy those rumors. I know people have asked us about them, and I wish it was true because those guys could both help, especially Taylor Ward. But I just don't buy the Angels are in that situation. All right. Murakami, Munenori Murakami, the infielder from Japan. I've seen a couple places here too. I've seen again, Jim Bowden mentioned that he could be a fit for Cleveland. Well, Jim Bowden doesn't know who's coming to Cleveland. Jim Bowden doesn't know where anybody's going. He doesn't know who's coming to Cleveland for sure. So I don't buy that. And I know I've seen other people say that there are some Japanese reports saying that Cleveland could be in. The only reason I don't buy it, A, is because it's not a position fit. He's a first/third baseman. They don't need a third baseman. And teams are asking him if he would be willing to DH. Cleveland doesn't really need a DH. He can't really play second. He can't really play outfield. So I don't see a position fit. I don't buy the sources. And the Guardians don't really play in the market in Japan. Now, should they? That's a different question. You know, I don't want to sit here and say, well, they don't do that, so they won't do it. Because if that was the case, they wouldn't have drafted Chase Lavalette and Nolan Schubart. You know, they took a different approach in the draft last year, and it's worth considering an approach change, considering their offensive struggles, right? They probably should. But if I'm going based on who the sources are, the market, the history, the positional fit, I'm not buying any interest. Like, he's a good hitter, but none of the things add up at this point. Maybe the Guardians will change their approach. You know, maybe they will do something different. Again, it might be worth them doing that because what they've been doing hasn't been working. But at this point in time, I don't think that's something really worth thinking about, talking about, unless we see more concrete evidence. All right, let's get to this before we get out of here. So, former Guardians assistant hitting coach Victor Rodriguez has been hired by the Houston Astros. Things are not as good as they were in Houston. I'm not sure Victor Rodriguez is planning to make like a Doug Funny and bang on any trash cans. You can finish the lyrics yourself, or if he carries any buzzers. But the Astros, you know, typically have been a better hitting organization than Cleveland. That's very easy to say. And before he went to Houston, he was with the Padres, and they also hit well. They had a hard time with power this year, but they've typically been a pretty good offensive club. They've had good offensive players. And we know that Rodriguez came from Boston before Cleveland when they were replacing Ty Van Berkelio. He came here as an assistant. So Victor Rodriguez, Chris Valaika, and then Jason Esposito, who we've talked about before, is with the Vanderbilt Commodores now as one of their hitting gurus and assistant coaches. All three of those guys have been hired elsewhere, despite the fact that Cleveland's offense has been mediocre to terrible at best. To me, let me ask you this. Does that suggest that coaching isn't the issue here and it's the talent? And it's possible those guys aren't good hires. Maybe they're not, you know? The Reds offense was not good this year. The Padres offense struggled this year. And the Astros offense has kind of gone in the wrong direction too, but they've also lost, you know, Alex Bregman. Yordan Alvarez was hurt. George Springer's not there anymore. Carlos Correa came back later in the year. They've lost a lot of their big offensive pieces. They traded Kyle Tucker. But I tend to think, you know, when we talk about the nature versus nurture debate here with all this, I think it falls on the side of the abilities. I really do, because why else would these guys be getting hired somewhere else? Now, again, results may not be great where they've been, but the Padres have been good offensively. But guess what? They've had in Victor Rodriguez's time there, they've had Juan Soto, and they've had Fernando Tatis, and they've had Manny Machado, and Jake Cronenworth has been pretty good. They had Jackson Merrill, who's pretty good. But all those guys were really well-developed talents. They traded to get Soto, but they signed Machado, but they also developed Fernando Tatis. They developed Jake Cronenworth. They developed Jackson Merrill. Those guys are pretty good hitters. And Houston has also had good hitters. The Red Sox have had good hitters. So the common denominator here may or may not be the coaching. It may be the talent. And that's kind of where I've always, you know, sided on this whole thing in terms of the Guardians hitting issues. Like, everyone's like, oh, you know, fire the hitting coach, fire this guy, he's not good. The Guardians have gone through multiple hitting coaches. People wanted Ty Van Berkeley gone. When they weren't good, they fired him. They brought in Chris Valaika, who, by the way, was an outside hire. Everybody said, don't promote him within. Okay, they brought in Chris Valaika from the Cubs organization. The offense took on the guards ball identity when they brought Chris Valaika in. Do you buy that Chris Valaika didn't want the team to hit home runs, and he wanted him to dink and dunk and slash and bloop their way and run their way to infield hits and forcing errors and wild pitches? Probably not. I think he would rather have the team hit the crap out of the baseball. And I know it didn't work in Cincinnati, but Cincinnati's lineup also was pretty disappointing too behind Ellie De La Cruz. And even he had his moments, but that was mostly because he got worn down this year. And then Chris Valaika got hired by the Reds with Terry Francona going there. Terry Francona loves his guy. It's not really a shock there. So Chris Valaika left for that, and the Guardians brought in Grant Fink, and they didn't do well this year offensively. You know, they've gone through 4 hitting coaches in the last 10 years, and their offense outside of 6. And what do the good offenses have in common versus the bad offenses? What do they contrast? Well, in 2016 they were good offense because you had Carlos Santana really good. Jose broke out. Lindor was here. Mike Napoli had a really good year. Kipnis had a really good year. Lonnie Chisenhall and Brandon Guyer made a great platoon. Okay, all those guys really worked out for you. Tyler Naquin had the only good year of his career, at least productive year of his career. They had really good options. 2017, you brought in Edwin Encarnacion, and you had Jay Bruce later in the year. Michael Brantley came back, and Jose took off even more. All those things added up. They were a better offense because they had better talent. And since then, the Guardians have been mediocre to bad, despite the fact that they've had 2 hitting coaches. I think Van Berkeley was still the coach in 17 and 8 or 16 and 17, but they've gotten rid of him since, and they brought in Valaika. That didn't go well, and even though everyone wanted to fire Van Berkeley, and then they brought in Valaika, and that didn't go well, and now they made the playoffs. Now he's in Cincinnati, and now with Grant Fink, they don't like it either. The coaches have been. This is the same thing I say about the Browns all the time. The Browns, they keep bringing in new GMs. They keep bringing in new coaches over the years. They keep bringing in new quarterbacks. And we keep seeing the same cycle of garbage in that factory of sadness, as we said yesterday about center field for Cleveland. Same thing over and over. The common denominator for the Browns is Jimmy Haslam. The common denominator for the Guardians and their offensive woes is their own talent development. It's not coaching. Let me know what you think, though, in the comments on this issue. I know we've had some questions before about it in a mailbag episode, but given how these guys are getting hired somewhere else, I tend to think it's the talent development. All right, on Monday, Jeff will be back with you solo. He'll catch you up on the weekend update news that will happen over the weekend. He wants to know, since people have really been enjoying his history segments, draft or trade history, he wants to know, let us know in the comments, or I'll do a poll if he should do on Monday a draft history or a free agent or trade history segment on Monday. Maybe we should do that for every segment, a weekly listener poll. Let me know what you think of that too. Until then, I want you to make sure you have a good, warm, and safe weekend. And in the meantime, go, Guardians, go. Drumming on my banjo.